Blessings, everyone. Thank you so much for coming back and joining us in this series, Why Christians Should Keep the Law. And today we're going to talk about the Lord's Day. Obviously, traditionally, this is a term that has come to be understood, that it refers to the resurrection of the Lord. It refers specifically to Sunday. And so this is just a very common understanding today. Well, I want to talk about this. And, this is going to be a very truncated version of this message that I would like to give. There are a lot of things that I'm cutting out of this discussion, just simply for the sake of time. But I want to give you some food for thought. There are some things that we need to appreciate because, obviously in Christianity, this term, the Lord's Day, is very, very special. And so I want to dig into this because this has everything to do, honestly, with the Sabbath. And so I want to begin by sharing some commentary with you from one of the most well-respected scholars alive today, Dr. Keener. And he is going to give a commentary specifically on Paul's first epistle to the Corinthians in chapter 16, verse 2. And in that passage, it talks about Paul commissions them that on the first day of the week, i.e. what we call Sunday, on the first day of the week, let's everyone lay aside something as he may prosper. And the whole context here is for the purpose of the saints, for being able to deliver support. Well, I want to share with you what he has to say in regard to this verse. He says, Christians also may have often met on the first day of the week. And notice how careful this scholar is in his articulation. May have often met on the first day of the week in honor of Jesus's resurrection. Although, and this is where it gets really important, although our first explicit evidence for this rule for Sunday comes from the 2nd century at the earliest, from half a century after Paul's letter. So what the good scholar is saying is we have no scriptural evidence for the apostolic church and even the growth outside of the apostolic church before the 2nd century. We have no evidence that Christians, whether Jew or Gentile, had believed that the first day of the week became a sanctified holy day in honor of the Lord's resurrection, to even, we say, to the detriment of the Sabbath. I mean, there absolutely is no scriptural support for this. It's not until you get to the 2nd century. And all you need to do is start going back to the literature we have that dates back to the 2nd century. Things like Ignatius's work and his letter to the Magnesians, which we read. See, it's at that time, at the turn of the century, you get into the 2nd century where you start seeing stuff you haven't seen in the New Testament. And that should be problematic. When Ignatius comes on the scene, let's abandon the Sabbath, and we're going to keep the Lord's Day. And he utilizes the term. Justin Martyr does the same thing. Again, Justin Martyr, hailing from the 2nd century. Justin Martyr suggests we don't keep the Sabbath. We are going to keep the Lord's Day. And that is in honor of the resurrection of Jesus. We could talk about the Epistle of Barnabas, again, dating back to the 2nd century. And even some scholars would add another work such as the Didache. And then, of course, you could go on into the 3rd and 4th century, and that work just begins to mount, whether we're talking about Cyprian, whether we're talking about Constantine and what happened there. I mean, it just continues. But the problem is we cannot scripturally support any transference of the sanctity and the holiness of Shabbat, Saturday, to Sunday in honor of the Lord's resurrection. It doesn't exist. In fact, what we find in Scripture is the expectation that his people, that the followers of Jesus Christ, his disciples, would be observing the seventh-day Sabbath. And this can be found in Matthew 24, as Jesus is prophesying of the days that are going to come, days of great tribulation, days where Jerusalem is going to fall. And he says in verse 20 of chapter 24, he says, pray that your flight may not be in winter or on what? The Sabbath. According to Jesus, in Jesus's expectation for his disciples, he still is of the opinion they'll be observing the Sabbath. And as we mentioned before, it's inscribed at creation, and it takes us all the way into eternity. It will still be observed in eternity, and everything in between is to be observed. And in other words, Jesus's words here tell us that even in this time of tribulation, even in time in the future, his disciples will be observing it. I think that is extremely notable. Now, that said, it is important to mention that there's only one time in the New Testament where the Lord's Day is mentioned. Only one time. I want to take you there. I want to read it to you. It's found in John's Apocalypse, or this book of Revelation. He says, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. Ante-Kyriake Hamera. So here you have John in the Spirit on the Lord's day. Now, to your traditional Christian today is going to look at this passage and go, oh, immediately what they think is that this is talking about Sunday. See, John observed Sunday as holy to the Lord in honor of Jesus' resurrection. This is what he did. But here's the thing. To this first century Jewish disciple, apostle of Jesus, when he makes the statement, the Lord's day, there's only one thing in this apostle's mind, and that can be scripturally proven, and that is the Sabbath. And so I want to take you back. This is not a reference to Sunday. This is explicitly a reference to Saturday, or what John would have called Shabbat. And so in Isaiah 58:13, check this out. If you turn your foot away from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure, now listen to this, on my holy day, Bayom Kadshi, my holy day. The Lord takes possession of this day, and he says, it's mine. This is my holy day. Well, it's interesting that the rhetoric that you'll hear from time to time by those Christians that believe that the day of the Sabbath can be any day of the week they want. Whatever day they personally choose, as though they can wave this magical theological wand and declare Tuesday holy, or Wednesday holy, or Thursday holy, when only God can declare what is holy. But they'll say, my Sabbath is on Tuesday, or my Sabbath is on Wednesday. I want to be clear. The Sabbath does not belong to us. The Sabbath belongs to the Lord. He takes possession of it. It is his day. And we, as followers of Jesus, can either agree and accept and adhere to that revelation, to that truth that, oh, we do recognize, Lord, you said this is your holy day. We acknowledge that. And we acknowledge it through, obviously, observance. Or you can flat out reject that. But there's no alternative here. It's either you accept the word of the Lord, you accept the reality that he is the Lord of the Sabbath, which isn't that what Jesus says in Matthew 12:8? For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Jesus takes possession and said he is Lord of the Sabbath. And you know what? I have this saying that the Sabbath has no longer ceased from being holy any more than Jesus has ceased from being the Lord of it. There is no scriptural evidence to support any change whatsoever, but actually just to the contrary. That Jesus's expectation is that his disciples would be keeping the Sabbath. Even in the midst of the tribulation, they would still be observing it. And even into eternity, they would still be observing it. And so when you think about John's words, as we look at them in the first chapter of the book of Revelation, that he was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, this is explicitly referring to the seventh day Sabbath, period. Now, that said, does that mean that you can't worship Jesus on Sunday because the Sabbath is the seventh day? Well, that's absurd. We're called literally to worship the Lord every single day. As Christians, I mean, you read text in the morning, noon, and at night. We're supposed to be drawing upon the beauty of God through his word. We're supposed to be in prayer and meditation of him throughout the day, every day. Every day, Christians are called to worship. But not every day is a Sabbath. Not every day is holy. God simply tells us when that day is. And it is on the seventh day. And again, we can either accept that or we can reject that. You know, as I mentioned before, this group known as the Ebionites, and Eusebius actually mentions them in his work, that he recognizes that, they observed the Sabbath, they never stopped keeping it, but they also held in as a memorial Sunday in honor of the Lord's resurrection. They did memorialize that day, and it was very beautiful, but it didn't come at the expense of the Shabbat, of the Sabbath, of the fourth commandment in Scripture. That's where we get ourselves in trouble, is where we are compromising the commandments of God for the sake of our own traditions. That's when you begin to worship him in vain. But it is not vanity to worship God on Sunday. That is not vain. Or Monday or Tuesday, every day of the week we should. But it is problematic when you say, I'm not going to acknowledge that you are the Lord of the Sabbath and that the Sabbath is eternal and that you have declared it to be holy. We have to be able to make good distinctions in this discussion. Now, let me close with this thought. I want to take you into the 2nd century in light of the fact that the only time that we see this whole concept of the Lord's Day being mentioned in the book of Revelation by John. I want to take you to a work that is called really Acts of the Holy Apostle and Evangelist, John, the Theologian. And I want to read to you an excerpt from this. And again, this is a 2nd century work. Pay attention. And on the 7th day, it being the Lord's Day, he said to them, now it is time for me also to partake of food. Isn't that interesting? That we see even into the late 2nd century, that this work that is attributed to the Apostle John and his life that had been preserved, we find the very one who said in Revelation, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day, we find in this 2nd century work that the Lord's Day was explicitly called the 7th day. That's all we have time for today. Stay tuned. We have so much more. The Lord bless you and keep you.